Hopefully the microphone will last this time. It is good to see everyone this morning. I'm glad that we can be here together to worship God together and to study from His Word. If you've been here the last few weeks, we have been going through a series called How Can I Relate? And what we've been looking at is, first of all, the fact that as Christians, if we want to share the gospel with others, it's more than just dumping information on them. We have to actually try, if we want to be effective at least, we want to actually try and relate to the person that we're trying to share the gospel with. That means, ultimately, we want to try and find some common ground with them, and we want to help them see that we truly care about them, about their soul, about their life, about what's important to them. If we aren't willing to do those things, to try and find that common ground to show them that we care, if we're not trying to relate, if we're not willing to relate, we're not going to be effective. We're just not, as we try and spread the gospel. And since we are called to spread the gospel, it is a responsibility on our part, not only to just give the information, but to try and relate to the people we are speaking to. We've talked about a couple of things specifically so far in this series. We've talked about relating to those from different cultures. That is difficult in many ways because there's just a lot of things we're not familiar with in that sense. And not just when we talk about different cultures as in people who live in different countries. There are a lot of different cultures even within our own country, whether that be people who have come here from other countries or subcultures within our own nation. Then we talked about the idea of how to relate to addicts, those struggling with various addictions, and the fact that ultimately there's a lot more to it than sometimes we are willing to give it credit for, and there are ways that we can be supportive and also ways we can be detrimental to the progress of those struggling with those things. We're going to talk about another subject along these lines this morning. This one is probably one of the most difficult that we will address, both difficult to talk about and difficult to know how to do. How can I relate to victims of abuse? Now, as we talk about these things, as usually we like to do, let's make a couple of things clear on what we're talking about. There are a lot of things that are classified, and I say that kind of in a sense of now they're classified as abuse. A lot of those things, I would argue, are valid. There are some that might have tried to take certain things that aren't really abuse and make them into abuse, but for the most part, I would argue that what we see in how things are defined is fairly accurate. What I mean by that is abuse does not just have to be physical. If someone punches someone, if someone beats someone, that certainly is abuse. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. If there are cases of sexual abuse and rape, certainly that qualifies as abuse. But there are other forms of abuse as well. We've talked before about things like manipulation or emotional abuse to a degree. That also fits in the category that we're talking about. Although it may not be as obvious, it certainly still fits within the parameters of our discussion as well as within some of the things we'll talk about in terms of how to help those who are victims of abuse. So I want to say that as we begin to understand, we're not just talking about physical or sexual abuse here. We're talking about anything that counts as one human being exerting such power over another as to cause them severe harm. That's abuse. Literally, it is the abuse of power, whatever that power might look like. And it can have devastating effects on every level of a person's humanity, identity, and all of that. We're going to encounter people who have been victims of abuse. Statistically, I would almost guarantee there are people in this room this morning that have been victims of abuse. Probably of each kind of abuse that we could try and lay out, at least broadly speaking. And yet, as we are going to try and reach out to those who need to hear the gospel, we're also going to encounter victims of abuse. Part of the reason for that, let's be honest, if we go through the Gospels and try and understand Jesus' approach, those who are hurting the most are often those who are most open to the gospel because they need help. Which presents a perfect opportunity for us to say, I know you need help. I want to show you the help not only that I can provide, but that Christ can provide. Those who are not hurting often don't feel like they need help. So we want to be aware of those who are going through those struggles, not only to offer them the immediate help that they need, which we'll talk about more to extend in a moment, but to recognize that there is something that can be healing to a degree that can never be accomplished simply by superficial means, for lack of a better word. But as we begin, let's consider some things. How do I relate to victims of abuse? Especially, I hope that this will be useful for those of us who may not have encountered abuse to the degree, at least, that we're talking about this morning. The first thing we need to understand, and this goes even if you have experienced some kind of abuse, if I'm talking to someone who has been abused, physically, emotionally, mentally, sexually, whatever the case might be, I don't know what you're going through. I don't. Is there common ground in the sense that we're both human? I can try and imagine? Sure. Is there maybe even common ground in the sense, maybe if you have been a victim of some sort of abuse before, you have a deeper sense of what the person is going through? Maybe. But you don't know that exact situation. Now, this is really a principle that goes far beyond situations of abuse. We don't know exactly what another person's gone through in any area of life. And if we try and present ourselves, even unintentionally, as, oh, I know exactly what you're going through, I understand what's going on with you, man, that is just the worst way to start off any kind of conversation, let alone any kind of attempt to connect with someone else. That's just not going to work. I don't know what you're going through. If I'm willing to admit that on the front end, that's going to go a long way. You can ask Liz. There's a lot of times where I've said things that, man, I wish I could take back. Not like mean things, just things that I'm like, oh, wow, that really didn't come off the way I want to. Oh, wow, I kind of insulted that person. I didn't mean to at all. Especially when we're dealing with extremely sensitive situations like this. There are a lot of times where something might come to mind, even something that we attempt to be comforting. Oh, wow, I know how you feel. I had this, just know it. We need to go into this situation understanding we have a lot of ignorance. Again, I don't mean to say that even if you have experienced some sense of abuse or not, there isn't common ground. There is common ground in a very limited sense, but there is a sense in which we need to be very careful how we try and approach people, and especially in situations like this where such just unimaginable pain is involved. Solomon said something very wise, as he was apt to do in Proverbs 18. He said, if one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and shame. Most situations, but especially situations like this, you know the best thing you can do when you're trying to bridge a gap, trying to build a connection, trying to relate to someone who has gone through a situation like this, you know the best thing you can do? Listen. Just listen. Now, especially when people are hurting, especially when there's a problem, we want to fix it. Especially guys, typically speaking. We want to help fix problems, right? We want to address things. We want to fix it. But usually, one of the biggest things that will help people who have struggled, especially if the situation's been resolved and it's the phase of, okay, now all this has happened, what do I do with this? What do I do with this heavy burden that is on my entire being because of what I have endured? A lot of times they just need people to listen. Think about the situation with Job. Job has been struck by Satan, not only with great loss of everything he possesses, but even with his own health deteriorating to the degree that literally his friends could not recognize him. I'm not saying necessarily that this is the actual disease that he was going through, but if you've ever looked at a picture of someone who has, how do I word this, experienced a fully matured version of smallpox, meaning it has consumed their body. If you've ever seen a picture of a person like that, or if you've seen that in person maybe even, depending on where you go in the world, that might give you some kind of an idea of what Job was going through. Literally unrecognizable. You know what his friends do when they first show up to try and comfort him? They see him, they begin weeping, and they sit on the ground with him, right next to him. They just sit with him for a whole week. And then they open their mouths and everything goes downhill. When they just sat there and they were with him, that was when ultimately, whether they intended to or not, they were communicating, I just want to support you. I'm not trying to tell you what's going on. I'm not trying to tell you what has happened, why this has happened. I'm not trying to give solutions. I'm just here. And then they started trying to give solutions. And then they started trying to tell him, here's why this is happening. Here's what's going on. And you know what God says at the end of the book, don't you? Yeah, none of y'all knew anything about what was going on. It's interesting. If you read at the very beginning of 1 Samuel, we have a very, very interesting story that's given. As always, I say that. True story, but told as a story. There's a woman named Hannah. She has not been able to have children. That's something that's very important to her, not just culturally speaking, but it's very important to her personally. And so as they go to Jerusalem for a feast, she is there. She is standing in the area where she can be, that is as close to God as she can get. Of course, during that time, they had a specific area, the temple or the tabernacle at this point, where she is trying to get as close to God as possible. And she's praying to God about the affliction of her heart that's going on. We probably often do this. This wasn't as common back then. She was praying in her mind. She was moving her lips even, but she wasn't actually speaking her prayer. Well, the priest, specifically the high priest, is there. Naturally, he's usually around during times like these at the tabernacle. And he sees her, standing there with her eyes closed, her lips moving, and he thinks she's drunk. Of course, eventually, he confronts her. He says, "How long will you go on being drunk? Put your wine away from you." Now, Hannah is of such a character. She doesn't take offense. She doesn't storm out of the tabernacle. She says, "No, you've misunderstood. I'm praying to God about something," and explains what it is. Imagine if she had instead been crushed. That even the high priest of the Lord assumed something about her without trying to get any information, gave her advice, even rebuked her. This could have been the end of all of her hope, all of her confidence, could have even driven her away from the true God. Don't make assumptions about what people are going through. If we want to relate to people who have been through such great pain as abuse, the first thing we need to do is recognize we don't know what's going on with them. We don't know what they're going through. We don't know how they're feeling. We don't know what it's like. We just need to be there. One of the worst things I can do in a situation like this is offer unsolicited opinions or advice on a situation I don't understand. It's one of the worst things I can do. But as we think about this idea further, we meet someone who has gone through something like this or is going through something like this. We recognize we need to be very careful about how we approach it, not assume things, not try and tell them things that they probably aren't even relevant to what they already know. But there's another thing that we need to do in these kinds of situations, especially when the situation is still going on. And this is even where it can get really tough. When I approach someone who has been or is being abused, they should never doubt that I am on their side. There have been many situations, not just in the religious world as a whole, but even in the Lord's church, as much as it breaks my heart to say it, where there have been active abuse situations going on. And because either of the fact that the person instigating the abuse is in some way prominent in the congregation or the community, or sometimes just because they happen to be part of the church, even if they're not prominent in any way. The church just kind of tries to sweep it under the rug. They ignore it. They don't want to do anything with it. They just let the abuser do their thing. They let the abused suffer. Now, you want to talk about something that God will hold us to in judgment. Now, please don't misunderstand. I'm not implying there's anything like that I know of going on in this congregation, but it has happened in congregations of the Lord's church. Maybe some even that you are aware of. Certainly some that I'm aware of. Again, not going into specifics or any particular place. One of our responsibilities as Christians, if I'm going to try and reach out to, try to relate to someone who is going through something difficult, that person needs to know that as a Christian, no matter what the fallout may be for me personally, I'm going to take their side. Now, let me add a caveat. We do need to make sure we have all the facts. There are times where abuse is claimed and is in fact a false accusation. We do need to be aware of that. We don't just need to take the side of someone without making sure we have the facts. But if we understand this is what's happening, this is the person who is instigating it, this is the person who is suffering as a result, the victim needs us. Even if the situation has been resolved, they need to know what happened to you was not okay. There is no sense in which I will ever condone what happened to you. I want to help you because you were the one who was hurt. One of the most difficult accounts that's given to us in the Bible, in the book of Samuel, 2 Samuel this time. David, as we are probably aware, like his son Solomon after him, had many wives. That was something that was tolerated under the old law, even though it was not ideal. It was never something that God liked. And because David had many wives, he had many children. Well, in the course of things, two of those children, in this case half-siblings, step-siblings, two of those children got involved in something very, very awful. And I say two of them, one of them being the victim, and one of them being the abuser. Tamar was one of the young daughters of David, and she caught the eye of her half-brother. Now she's her half-brother. Obviously, even in ancient times, there is nothing about that is acceptable. But he is so insistent that he eventually finds a way to get her alone with him, and he abuses her. He then sends her away. He doesn't want her anymore. Now, what is so tragic about that story is not just what happened. David is still king at this point. The problem is, Amnon is his firstborn. He's angry. Oh yes, he's angry that this happened. He's angry that his son took advantage of his daughter. He's angry about everything that happened. He's mad that that happened. You know what it never says in the entirety of the Old Testament, in the entirety of all the records? There's multiple records, by the way, of David's life. You know what it never says David did? Anything besides get angry. If you look at the law of Moses, there were two crimes that were committed here. There was both rape and incest committed in this incident. But this is the crown prince of Israel. What eventually happens to Amnon is not a trial, is not any kind of lawful reconciliation of this to where the criminal is brought to justice. No, instead what happens is he's murdered by the full brother of Tamar, Absalom, because David didn't do anything. More often than not, that scenario is very real in the lives of victims of abuse. Very, very many times, those who are abused, even when it's brought to light, the ones who can do something about it, who should do something about it, often don't. Sometimes it is a spouse who sees children being abused in his or her own household and doesn't do anything to stop their spouse from doing so. Sometimes it is extended family who sees a spouse being abused by the other spouse and doesn't do anything about it. At times, even, there are situations where authorities see things going on and don't do anything about it, and as we've seen in the church, it happens too. Now, there are limited options when you are not exactly in the middle of something like that, when you are not one of the principal parties involved. Keith could tell us a lot from the law standpoint about what you can and can't do. But I'll tell you one thing you can do. You can make sure the victim knows that you want to help them in whatever way you possibly can, that you are not in any way buying anything from the perspective of the other person. Any of the lies, any of the ways of hiding them, because, that always goes on in these kind of situations. If you remember in 1 Corinthians 5, there's this incident that Paul has to address. A man has taken his father's wife, most likely his stepmother, to be his own. Rather than taking care of that situation, the church is just allowing it to go on. Now, I want to remind you, in that situation, in the ancient world, it is very possible that the woman involved in that does not have a say in the matter. In either case, it's wrong, whether or not it is a situation of mutual consent or not. Either way, it's wrong, clearly. But it's very likely that the woman really doesn't have much she can do to remove herself from that situation. Although, again, we don't know for sure. Either way, we see what the church did in Corinth before Paul reprimanded them. They just let it happen. In fact, they were even puffed up about it. Probably, they were puffed up about it in the sense of, we are so accepting that we will even allow these people to continue, or this person, depending on the situation, to continue in our midst. Paul says, that's not what should happen. If you remember in 3 John, John is writing to an individual who I would argue in a very real sense is a victim of abuse. Nothing physical, nothing sexual. He is a member of a congregation where one individual is trying to take power, a man named Diotrephes. This individual is trying to take power in this congregation, and he is trying to enforce his will on those within it, to the extent that anyone aligned with other Christians he doesn't like, he is willing to kick those people out of the church. Now I want you to imagine a Christian who is doing nothing but the right thing before God, and they are being threatened by a brother in Christ who is supposed to be an ally by saying, I'm going to kick you out of this church. Not just I'm not going to have anything to do with you. I am going to wield my power to cut you off from everyone. Remember, this is in a time when Christians weren't exactly popular in their culture. So if you're a Christian, but you're cut off from the church, you've got nobody. You know what? Want to know what John says to him? He says 2 things. He says, number 1, you aren't doing anything wrong. Many of us are probably aware one of the most common tactics an abuser will use is to try and convince the victim that somehow they're in the wrong. No matter what kind of abuse we're talking about. That's part of how the abuse works. That's part of how they keep the person where they want them. They try and twist things to where they're the ones who have the problem. They're the ones who are making the mistake. They're the ones who are wrong. Guy who says, no, you're doing what's right. John says to guys, you're doing what's right. Not only that, he says, I am going to do whatever is in my power to expose the man who is abusing you. When we meet people who are going through situations like this, they need to know we're on their side. There should never be any doubt that we might be trying to stay neutral, that we might be trying to, this person says they didn't do it. Again, if we have the facts and know what's going on, which sometimes we don't, and that makes it tough. But when we know what's going on or what has gone on, we have a responsibility. Abusers are experts at hiding their actions or shifting the blame to their victims. We must not leave the innocent at the mercy of such lies. Recovery is already going to be hard enough for victims of abuse if everything is resolved and they are surrounded by a safe, loving environment and safe, loving people. It's already going to be hard enough. The trauma that results from abuse is devastating. But man, you want to talk about compounding that. If people treat you as if, well, maybe part of it was your fault. Thirdly, similar to what we've talked about, not just do the people who have gone through such awful experiences need to know we're on their side. We can be on their side and still be distant. I can say, that's wrong, I'm going to make sure that's fixed, and then once everything's done, we just kind of, all right, I hope everything gets better, and leave them to their own devices. At this point in their lives, more than ever, people who have gone through such things, they don't just need people to fix the situation, quote unquote. Again, we can't fix it in that sense, but to make sure that within our power, things are righted. They don't just need that. They need friends. They need people who will support them, people who will care about them. The most effective thing that an abuser can do to a victim is isolate them. So once that cycle is broken, they've been isolated often for years, maybe even decades, depending on the situation. They haven't had anyone. They haven't had anyone who can just sit there and cry with them. They haven't had anyone who they can trust. They need friends. Not friends, hey, how's it going? Bye. They need friends. It's hard to be friends with people who we don't fully understand, who we don't share identical experiences with. It's especially hard to be friends with people that we feel like we don't know how to help. Because it kind of feels awkward. I feel like I should be doing something and I don't know what to do. I feel like I don't even know what emotions are. There's so much that we don't know. There's so much that's foreign to us. And when we're in situations like that, our knee-jerk response is to create some distance. Our knee-jerk response is to just, let me find somebody else who can be your friend. But as we talked about, they don't need people to fix them. They're not broken anyway in that sense. Maybe they've been broken in the sense that others have hurt them, but they're not broken in the sense that something's wrong with them. Our job is not to fix them. Our job is to befriend them. Our job is to show them that not everyone in the world is a monster. Our job is to show them that some people love them just because they're them. Rejoice with those who rejoice, Paul says in Romans 12. Weep with those who weep. It's interesting, if you look at the context of Romans 12, this particular section in particular, he's not really talking just to Christians. He's not really just talking about within the church, rejoice and weep with those who are doing so. The very next verse, he's talking about our interactions with others outside of the body. That's one of the best ways we can relate to people. You see someone sobbing on a park bench, you know what you can do? You can just go up to them. You don't even have to ask what's wrong. Just sit there and mourn with them. James says something very interesting. James chapter 1, the end of chapter 1, he says, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their trouble or in their affliction. And he also says to keep oneself unspotted from the world. But I want to look at this first part, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction. Why is it that he specifies orphans and widows? You ever think about that? We've probably heard this verse quoted many times. Why orphans and widows? In the society in which James is writing, orphans and widows are the most vulnerable. Orphans and widows are the easiest ones to be victims of others in all sorts of different ways. Some of the most vulnerable in our society are those who are victims of abuse. And James says religion that is pure and undefiled before God is to visit these people in their affliction. In other words, they are suffering. We just need to be there to help, not to force ourselves on them, to offer ourselves in whatever way we can be helpful, just to be present, just to be a friend. But you notice what he says next as he begins chapter 2. The very next verse. My brothers, show no partiality as you hold the faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. Now he goes on to give an example of rich and poor, but that's not the only way we can show partiality, is it? You would be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't, at how many people who have suffered through some form of abuse go into a religious atmosphere, even go into the church, and everyone just kind of treats them like a pariah, kind of treats them like an outsider, not because they're not fun to be around, not because they don't have a fun personality, not because they're unfriendly, because they're just, they're the person that happened to. And it's not that even people consciously blame them for it even. They just aren't comfortable around. And so they don't really spend time with them. I don't think we can fully imagine, unless we've been through that, just how much more pain that adds to an already devastating situation. I'm so glad you're comfortable. They're dying inside. And you've just made it worse. I was a stranger, Jesus said. You did not welcome me. Naked, you did not clothe me. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list, my friends. Someone who is hurting, someone who is in need, and I walked by. That's what Jesus says. That's the difference between those who are right with him and those who aren't. I see someone hurting, the least of these, and I help where I don't. Not just I help in a removed sense. I love. Love is not something that is detached. Love is not something that we can do and maintain a level of comfort when we're uncomfortable. Love inherently requires us to put ourselves out there a little bit more than we're comfortable with. I need to see Jesus in that person. Because you know what? Guess how many times Jesus was abused, in this case physically, as he went to the cross. And guess how many people wanted to be around him while that was going on. Even the few who were, for a little while, ran away. That shouldn't be us. Now more than ever, those who have suffered abuse need a safe place to belong. And we must offer that. That's true of everyone, right? Everyone needs a family. Everyone needs to belong. Everyone needs a sense of trust and safety. But you want to talk about who need it, those who need it even more. It's those who are enduring or recovering from a situation like this. And so often, they're the ones who are least likely to get it because people are uncomfortable. We can be Jesus to that person if we see Jesus in them. He says, I was hungry, thirsty, naked, a stranger, sick. When you help them, you help me. Those who are suffering abuse or have suffered abuse need Christians to step up and offer them safety and acceptance. Oftentimes, when we think about evangelism, for whatever reason, we think about those who are like us, who are just living normal lives. I know not everyone in this room is living normal lives. I'm talking about on average. Those who are just living normal lives, who don't have anything major going on, those are the ones we're really comfortable because they're most like us, and we can reach out to them. And yet often the ones not only who need help the most, but often who are most likely to listen to the message of hope we have to offer are the ones who are suffering in ways like this. Friends, we need to step up. If there's any way we can encourage or help you this morning, especially if there is something that is going on in your life that is difficult along these lines, this is not necessarily the place to make it known publicly, but we want to help in whatever we can. Whether that's coming to one of the elders or one of the members and saying something, whatever the case might be, we just want to be there to support one another. Please let us know if there's a way we can help as we stand and sing.
I am resolved no longer to linger, charmed by the world's delight.